talk about the hard problem of consciousness, 5 approaches is the title of his talk. He will explain which 5 those are.
Okay, thank you. Hello everyone. My name is Jack Ray, and I will be presenting on the paper that I wrote. The first part of the title, Hard Problem of Consciousness, 5 Approaches, refers to the topic of the paper and presentation, which is the hard problem of consciousness, which I will explain shortly. The second part refers to the fact that I will be looking at 4 approaches used by 4 different philosophers, not including the author of the hard problem paper itself. And the 5th approach comes from my own thought. And I consider it a synthesis of the 4 approaches that I will be giving an account of. So to begin with, let's talk about consciousness. It just so happens that all of you are experiencing it right now. In philosophy of mind, when we talk about consciousness, we're talking about the subjective realm of our existence. It's our thoughts, our feelings, our volitions, and our sensations, by which I mean such things as our experience of a 3-dimensional visual field, sensations of hot and cold, etc. It is your personal inner life of the mind. Thus, since we are directly experiencing it every waking second of every single day, we are led to believe that we are intimately acquainted with it and we understand how it works. This is not the case, though, at least not completely. The hard problem of consciousness is a philosophical problem that has its modern roots in the mind-body problem, which some of you are probably somewhat familiar with. This problem was most famously articulated by René Descartes in the 17th century. The problem, roughly, is the question, how is my objective brain related to my subjective mind? In Cartesian terms, the question is how the extended thing, body, and the thinking thing, or the mind, could be one, thus the mind-body problem. Descartes believed that they are not one and the same, and that the mind was a completely different sort of thing metaphysically from the body, and this is classical Cartesian substance dualism. The hard problem of consciousness puts a somewhat new spin on the mind-body problem. It was articulated formally by the Australian philosopher David Chalmers in 1995 in his paper Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness. Since then, the problem has been one of the major focuses of contemporary philosophy of mind. Before I go into Chalmers' theory, though, some background on the hard problem of consciousness is useful. The hard problem as articulated by Chalmers is indebted to 2 earlier philosophers of the 20th century. The first philosopher that he is indebted to is Thomas Nagel, whose 1974 paper, What is it like to be a bat?, put forth the claim that any science of consciousness must be able to account for the first-person experience of consciousness. In other words, it must be able to say what it is like to experience the world as a person, or as a bat, or as any sort of consciousness. Chalmers is also indebted to the philosopher Joseph Levine, who in 1983 contributed the term explanatory gap. A bit of a jargon word, it refers to the gap that we perceive between explanations of the body and explanations of the mind, and it is at the heart of the hard problem of consciousness. With that background in mind, we can move forward to Chalmers' paper, Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness. So the best way to explain the hard problem is to first say what it is not. The hard problem is contrasted by Chalmers with the easy problems of consciousness, and these are problems that we can solve through objective science. According to Chalmers, these include explaining the ability to discriminate, categorize, and react to environmental stimuli, the reportability of mental states, the focus of attention, the deliberate controlled behavior, among other things. These problems are only considered easier than the hard problem, but by no means are they easy problems. Nevertheless, these explanations merely require observation of mechanisms in the brain. Such explanations surely fall in the sphere of what neuroscience can do, because mechanistic explanations are the kind of third-person objective observations that science deals with. What neuroscience cannot explain, however, is the hard problem of consciousness. This is the problem of experience. Recall that when I say experience, I'm talking about your experience of the world around you. Right now, for example, you're experiencing me. You're looking at me, listening to me, maybe, and thinking about me, or at least about the things that I'm saying. So let's talk about your experience of seeing me. What's happening when you see me? What is going on in your brain as you see me? Well, I can't be sure what your own explanation of seeing me is, but perhaps one among you is a physicist, and you give an account of how light reflects off my body and my features onto your eye. Perhaps one among you is a psychologist, or 2 among you are psychologists, and you give an account of how after that light hits your retina, it activates specific neural pathways that are processed by the visual cortex, giving you the sensory experience of me. Now, I would say that those are two very fine explanations, but there's something missing from those explanations. You merely explain functions and mechanisms in the brain that somehow led you to experience something. You did not explain the connection between the mechanism and the experience. So how did those mechanisms give you that experience? If I open up your brain, for example, where would I find the experience of me in your brain? In other words, says Chalmers, you did not account for the hard problem. And now perhaps you can see why it is so hard. It goes all the way back to the mind-body problem. There seems to be a correlation between the physical states of the brain and our phenomenal experiences of the world. But we don't know what goes on in between. Thus, there's an explanatory gap between the two. And in case you're thinking of saying that we simply don't understand it now because our science isn't advanced enough, Chalmers says that we will never be able to reduce consciousness to physical states, no matter what our science is like. Science always relies on the third-person, objective, and public viewpoint of one or more observers. Consciousness is fundamentally a first-person, subjective, and private viewpoint of one, and only one, experiencer. So we've ruled out reductive explanations, that is, explanations that reduce the mental down to the physical. Now, it seems that that's our only option. So what are we supposed to do now? Says Chalmers, we need a non-reductive explanation of consciousness to partially, if not fully, account for the hard problem. He suggests that experience be understood as somehow fundamental in the same way that mass, charge, and space-time are regarded as fundamental in our physics. And where there is a fundamental property, he says, there are fundamental laws. And these are what Chalmers calls psychophysical laws. Chalmers gives a few examples of these, but I won't go into them because they're a little bit out there and hard to understand. But for our purposes, all we need to know is that these psychophysical laws are somehow supposed to account for how consciousness is fundamental. So now we have Chalmers' take on the hard problem of consciousness. So what do others have to say about it? So the first response that I will look at is by the philosopher Daniel Dennett. Dennett represents what is known as the reductionist. Dennett thinks that the hard problem is a complete waste of time and resources. In his provocatively titled Facing Backward on the Problem of Consciousness, Dennett has us think back to the 19th century vitalists, who, if you don't know, believed in an élan vital, or a life force that animated living creatures, and imagines the hard problem for life, for a vitalist. There are the easy problems of life, such as reproduction, development, growth, etc. But none of these answer the question of life itself. How can describing the easy problems amount to an explanation of the hard problem? It turns out that simply giving an account of the easy problems is all that life really is. There is no magical extra ingredient that somehow explains life as a whole. According to Dennett, the hard problem of consciousness is the exact same way. Chalmers is only making the hard problem so hard by seeing only one big complex problem where there's really only many simple problems. The second of the four responses I will look at belongs to Patricia Churchland, who has a similar take on the hard problem as Dennett, but she objects to it on different grounds. According to her, it is the case that at some point in the future we'll have the technology to figure out how consciousness arises. According to her, Chalmers' call for an extra ingredient for explaining consciousness is based on fallacious reasoning. Just because we don't know what something is does not mean we can ever know it. Our technology just needs to catch up with our ideas, and according to Churchland, Chalmers is jumping the gun and trying to get at the fundamentals of the science of consciousness at this moment in time. The third response to the hard problem of the four comes from Colin McGinn. He takes up the Messerian view on the hard problem, which is the view that we simply can never fully come to understand consciousness, or know it in the way that we understand and know other observable physical phenomena. McGinn is not trying to refute the hard problem per se. He is more interested in explaining what it is that makes the hard problem so hard. One might say that he is more concerned with the foundations of the explanatory gap than the foundations of consciousness. McGinn invokes the philosopher P.F. Strawson in his theory of space. For Strawson, the spatial framework of our phenomenal experience is prior to our actual intentional content about the things that we think about. That's quite a mouthful, but the idea behind it isn't all that complex. When we think about things, we do just that. We think about them. This is what is called the intentional content of your thoughts by philosophers. It might be easier to just think of it as merely the contents of your thoughts. When you're looking at me and thinking about the things that I'm saying, and you're cognizant of it, you're forming ideas in your head. In order to think about anything at all, you must use language. Therefore, language is necessary for thought. But our intuitions about space come way before language in our construction of the external world. Such spatial intuitions are, in fact, required to make thinking possible. We have convictions about the fundamental spatiality of physical objects, and this is prior to our thoughts and our ideas about things. The problem with consciousness, though, is that it is clearly non-spatial, and thus seemingly non-physical. This is the thinking behind many stripes of dualists. McGinn appeals to Strawson here in an attempt to show that we will never fully understand what consciousness truly is, because in order to do so would be to abandon the very structure of our thought, which is our language. So the fourth and final view, before my own, on the hard problem that I'm looking at comes from Jonathan Shear, who takes the developmentalist approach in his paper, Closing the Empirical Gap. Like McGinn, Shear does not seek to refute any of Chalmers' claims. Instead, he is also saying what it is that makes the hard problem so hard. He suggests that consciousness and the explanatory gap arise from the way in which our brain develops as we physically mature as human beings. Whereas many philosophers, including Descartes, have insisted that the structure of consciousness is given to us, and indeed it seems that way from all of our experiences, that is, it's given to us and known without direct previous acquaintance, Shear points to the field of cognitive development to show that this is not necessarily the case. According to Shear, the contents of our consciousness that we think are given to us are actually learned by us as we develop as human beings. When we consider the structures of conscious experiences for children, things start to get interesting. It turns out that much of what we thought of as givens is actually the result of normal and regular development of the human brain. There's a consensus among researchers, Shear says, that young children have experiences, learn in the first 2 years of their life to integrate a subset of them according to the topological features characteristic of physical objects, by which I think he just means the appearance of physical objects. Children then find during the third year of life that these topological integrations sometimes are and sometimes are not appropriately supported by the behavior of other people. And they generate accordingly the distinction between public physical and private mental objects and experience. And then progressively, largely between the ages of 3 and 5, they learn to sort their experiences according to these categories of mental and physical. In other words, children learn during the first 5 years of their life how to order and understand the world around them. From there, that develops into social understanding, and the hard problem, as well as the mind-body problem, is thus the result of how our minds are conditioned to process the world around us. This all brings me to my own idea of how to approach the hard problem of consciousness, the fifth approach that I will be discussing. I think that all the philosophers that I've examined, including Chalmers, are circling around the right ideas, but it seems to me that a synthesis of their ideas might give us better mileage than their ideas isolated from one another. So let's begin with Chalmers. I think the hard problem is a valuable contribution to contemporary philosophy of mind, even if it is simply as an example of one way that we should not look at consciousness. One way or the other, it seems to me that he is onto something. No, a reductive explanation will not fully suffice for describing phenomenal experience, but it can give us some insight as to where and how phenomenal experience works. What seems to me to be the most fundamental and interesting aspect of consciousness is that it is very clearly connected to the physical brain. Philosophers describe the relationship between the mental and the physical brain as one of supervenience. This piece of jargon is used to characterize a relation between properties that is stronger than that of causation. For a property to supervene on another property, there necessarily cannot be a change in one without a change in the other. So I think that this is where I agree with Dennett and Churchland. I think that they are correct in saying that the mind can be reduced down to the physical brain for many practical purposes, but I err on the side of caution, like Chalmers, in saying that this is all there is to consciousness yet. I think Churchland has a good point in saying that a proper view should most likely be entrusted to future generations and advances in cognitive neuroscience. What bothers me the most about the reductive views, though, and that is the views that reduce the mind down to mere operations and processes in the brain, is that to some extent differences in physical brain processes don't map onto the differences in the mental experience of other things. This is not something that I really encountered other philosophers worrying about. There are numerous systems in the brain, such as the brainstem, that seem to automatically control certain behaviors, such as breathing, blinking, the beating of the heart, etc. Although these processes can indirectly affect our consciousness by ceasing to operate or malfunctioning, these processes can't directly affect our conscious experience, and we can't consciously control them. So what are we to say about them? This is where I think Chalmers gets his ideas about the easy problems, explaining the functions in the brain and not consciousness itself. There seems to be some brain processes that on one hand don't cause changes in our phenomenal experience, and some that do. And the hard problem, it seems to me, is looking for an answer as to why some of them do and why some of them do not. So what I propose can be called a sort of developmental mysterious take on the hard problem. I call it this because I mostly agree with elements of McGinn in Mysterianism and Scheer in developmentalism. I agree with McGinn that consciousness is fundamentally non-spatial, but I disagree with him insofar as I think that consciousness can still be studied and can still be said to be physical. Consciousness has to be physical, or at least be the byproduct of certain mental processes in the brain. Since I have no idea what these processes might be or look like, especially from a neuroscientific standpoint, since I lack that kind of background, I simply call these processes conscious processes. And I think that's what Scheer is talking about, conscious processes, because these are the processes that make our conscious experience and cognition possible and are filled in by social conditioning. Thus, as we develop as humans, our brain develops to accommodate a broader structure of the self and the world, and through learning, that broader structure is itself built. A crude example would be like a computer's hardware and software. The computer provides the platform and is hardwired to accommodate the software, which maps onto and uses the specific aspects of the hardware. Thus, the hardware is required for the software. I call this a crude example because I do not want to suggest in any way that the mind is like a program or that the brain is like a computer in the ways that they actually work or process information. The ways in which software maps onto the hardware is what I'm trying to emphasize, and the necessity of the hardware for the software to even exist as well as function. So, in conclusion, we have a hard problem, and if we have a problem, there must be a solution, right? Problem might be a misnomer here, because it seems to me that we won't ever have a satisfying solution, at least as far as Chalmers articulates the hard problem. Nevertheless, I think the hard problem is valuable, and is worth thinking about because it serves as a lesson in the limits of what we can and cannot know. I think that is a very important and noteworthy contribution to philosophy of mind, psychology, and cognitive neuroscience, because it gives us an idea of our relationship to the very framework of our experience, that which we know most intimately and best. The conscious mind, or subject, or soul, or self, or ego, or whatever name you want to call it, is what we experience as ourselves. I cannot think of anything that has more existential or spiritual significance than our very selves. Since we undoubtedly can talk confidently about not only ourselves but the world around us and the other people as well, it seems very odd indeed that we can never come to understand how or why this should ever come to be as a result of physical processes that go on in our brains. Just on a closing note, to leave you something to think about, consider the idea of philosophical zombies, another idea of David Chalmers related to the problem of consciousness. It's a thought experiment that demonstrates the hard problem. A philosophical zombie, Chalmers says, is one that has all the same functions and mechanisms in the brain, and all of them working just like you and me, but does not have any conscious experience whatsoever. Thus, when you look at the zombie's brain and that of a conscious human being right next to each other, you would see no difference whatsoever. Indeed, there's no way of knowing that anyone is more than just a philosophical zombie of this nature. They talk like us, they look like us, and they act like us, but they don't actually have any experience. There's no person that is all happening to who's inhabiting the body. If the human being is a ghost in the shell, then this is a shell without the ghost. Thus the question arises, could one ever know that there is consciousness because of the presence of certain physical processes? Could one ever observe the brain and get an idea of what the person within, so to speak, is experiencing, what it is like to be that person? That, ladies and gentlemen, is the hard problem of consciousness. Can't be sure what kind of progress we'll make in it, but it's my thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. You have given us a lot to think about, and now I think it's time for us to give it some more to think about.
Clarification question, comment question as well. I can't say I'll clarify anything though, but
So, conscious processes are, you say that they have to be physical. but they're not spatial.
Mhm.
What do you mean by that specifically?
It's a little bit hard to say, and I mean, we've struggled with this a lot in STEM, as you know, which clearly you're pushing me on this contentious point, Ben. But, I mean, I think my favorite way to, I think the best way to go about explaining what I mean is to use analogies. I mean, I think that there are other things that are physical that are not spatial. They might have a spatial component to them, which I think consciousness does have, since clearly we experience space. But for example, gravity gravity itself, the effect of it, is caused by the mass of an object. However, gravity isn't the object itself. It isn't a physical object that we can see or hold on to or manipulate or anything like that. I think it is spatial because it does have this effect on space. I think another one that I'm fond of is electromagnetism, same sort of thing. I don't know exactly how electromagnetism works, but I mean, when a magnet attracts another magnet, it's not the case. The electromagnetism isn't the magnets themselves. It's a relationship between the two that is fundamentally not exactly physical. It has an effect on the physical, but it isn't self-physical.
So conscious processes are kind of like a force.
Yes, in a certain sense. I think conscious processes, or I mean, you can refer to it as just consciousness as a whole. I think I can't explain to you why it is that I experience the world as it is, or why any of us experience the world as it is. But it seems to be the case that we all experience something common to us. So I would say almost that, like, perhaps the visual field, to some extent, is some sort of non-spatial force that it doesn't necessarily have an effect on objects, although some research in quantum physics might suggest otherwise, but I won't go anywhere near that. Essentially, I lost my train of thought. But essentially, yeah, it's basically like it originates here and then it goes out from there. I saw a question in the back, I think from Hannaford.
I better stay out of that. I mean, it's way over my head. I was thinking you were talking about the zombies, and all of you guys may be zombies, and we can't know anything about what you're thinking, but it really seems to me that we have to accept a conventional meaning of terms, and according to which, when I express myself, I understand that you understand, that I understand that you understand. And I don't know where to go about with zombies if we have conventional terms according to which I can only conceive of myself in terms that you use to conceive of yourself. And that may be way far away from the hard problem, but it also seems to me to be related to the developmental issue that 3- and 4-year-olds really can't get onto what the adults are thinking. Whilst they learn the language and they learn to manipulate, and it seems like you can't deal them out of life.
Right.
I
mean, they're just as human as
these are just some of my puzzles. I'm sorry I can't ask a question.
Well, no, I mean, I agree. I think that a lot of it is solidified and, I think, a philosophical term, reified. That is to say, made into something that is real. I mean, 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds don't seem to understand, for example, object permanence. If they think that if they can't see an object,